Good morning, folks. Today's video is going to be things to look for when purchasing a used outboard motor. This video is going to be catered towards the casual mechanic or outboard motor enthusiast who's looking for advice on buying a new motor for their boat, whether 2 or 4 stroke, anything from a 2 horsepower up to the big V6s, V8s. This video should be able to help you out. As you can see, we got a lot of motors here, so I'm going to be using some of them to demonstrate certain things to look for in buying an outboard motor. Now this video is going to be if you're in the situation where you see a motor on Craigslist or on Facebook Marketplace or whatever, and it says 100% ready to go, bolted on motor. If you're buying a project or if you're looking on something you can tinker with, go ahead and go nuts so long as the price is right. However, this is supposed to be advice for motors which are at market value because they are 100% ready to go. So first things first, make sure that it's actually the motor that you want. There are a couple of specifications to keep in mind when purchasing an outboard motor. First off, you need a short shaft, long shaft, or an extra long shaft. That would be for the big motors, 20, 25, or 30 inches on your transom. Certain boats come with longer transoms, so if you have your old motor that you're replacing, go ahead and measure it. Or if you happen to know what it is, then be sure that you're looking for a motor which is either a short shaft, long shaft, etc. To figure out if you need a short shaft or a long shaft motor, this is where you measure from. You measure from the very bottom of the transom mount here, so if this board here is the transom, right here, all the way down to the cavitation plate. On this one, this is a long shaft motor, so this is 25 inches. Over here, that's a short shaft motor, so that one's only 20 inches. Second, think about what brand you want. There are a couple of big hitters out there. There's Mercury, there's Johnson Evinrude's, which are pretty compatible. They were both made by OMC, and so they're pretty much the same motor. You have Mariner, which was made by Yamaha or Mercury at different times. You have Force, which is made either by Mercury or Chrysler at different times. You have Yamaha, you have Hondas, and you have Suzuki's. Everyone has a favorite, everyone is right. There really isn't any one or another that's any better in my opinion. They're all great motors if you take care of them. So the rest of this video is going to be about assessing whether or not these motors were taken care of. Alright, so suppose you go to the seller's place and the motor's up on the stand like this. It's not practical to do a sea trial on it. We're going to take a really good look at these motors and make sure that they're good to go. First off, take a good healthy look at the exterior of the motor. You start at the top. If you're concerned about cosmetics, give a good look at them. If not, you can skip over it, doesn't really matter. But make sure that the cowl is undamaged all the way around. It's not cracked, it hasn't been blown off the boat while it was being trailered or whatever. The cowl gasket right down here is a good gasket which makes a good seal. This seal is important because it keeps everything nice and dry inside. Take a whole long look down the leg, down to the lower unit. Make sure we don't have any oil seepage around in here. You can take a look if there's any kind of barnacles or corrosion all around here. Typically that stuff is cosmetic and can be cleaned off. Take a look at your propeller if it comes with one. You'll either see generally stainless steel or aluminum propellers. Just make sure they're not chipped up, especially around here, around the fins. Make sure they're not bent. Not a big deal, it's just one nut and it comes off, but that's, you know, a $200 or $300 expense if you're going to be replacing it. Also, considering expenses, if this motor does not come with controls and your old motor was, say, an Evinrude and this one's a Mercury, you're going to need to get controls for this outboard motor. You can buy them used on eBay, typically maybe $150 if you really look around. New ones can be quite pricey, so just keep that in mind. Alright, now we're going to pop the cowl off and just take a look at what's going on inside. You want to look for any major corrosion. Make sure that all the linkage operates as it should. This is a carbureted model, so it's got a lot of linkage, and it's also got the oil mixer down in there. So a lot of hoses, a lot of linkage. Just make sure it moves Nice and greasy fittings all throughout there. Look for corrosion around your electrical connections. If you have an internal tank like this one, make sure it's not leaking. Now, a question I get asked a lot when I'm selling outboard motors is this a saltwater or freshwater motor? Fair question. I haven't found that there is much of a difference in how they run from saltwater or freshwater usage. You can have a salted to hell motor that still runs fantastic, or you can have a freshwater motor that is beat to shit. So that doesn't mean that it's you know, a bad motor if it's a saltwater motor. However, there is a significant hurdle in servicing it when you find stuff like this. Saltwater corrosion, which has been leaking out of the water jacket gasket all throughout here, stuff like this. It's going to make getting bolts like these, especially if you're going after a thermostat or you got to get the water jacket off to replace the gasket, very, very difficult to get out, and oftentimes they snap. So that is just something to keep in mind when you're buying a motor like this, and it should be priced accordingly. Pain in the ass to get some of these out because some of them are tiny little 10mm bolts, and they just snap, 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 snap all the way around if it's been a saltwater motor that has not been diligently flushed. If you are buying a saltwater motor that has been flushed all its life, it will still look really good like a freshwater motor because you get that salt water out before it has the opportunity to make corrosion like this. So just because it's a saltwater motor doesn't mean it's a bad motor. That's the bottom line there that I'm going for. The most common place to find information about your motor is down here on the serial number tab. They're often mounted either on the transom mounts or down here on this bracket here on either side, and most manufacturers put the tab right down there. Not a bad idea to compare serial numbers if you have like another information plate like this one, just to give a good look-see. And I've run into this once before where somebody changed the mount to be a much newer motor than it actually was. So like this tab and that tab did not match up, and this one was a lot newer, and so they were asking a lot more money for it. So just consumer awareness, FYI type of thing. Alright, now we're going to fire it up. A word of advice before we fire it up. These motors, if you compare them to, let's say, you know, a newer consumer vehicle, or you know, a car or truck or whatever, something that's new and fuel injected, etc., etc., these motors are not going to behave the same. They were made to be reliable. They were made to run on low compression or with a little bit of water in the oil or the gasoline, or they were made to get you home, basically. Made to run hot, made to be reliable, not efficient. So if you are starting this thing up and it takes a couple revs to get over, or let's say it fires and dies and then it fires and it stays running, that's not bad. I don't consider that to be a you know, an absolute deal breaker if I'm buying a motor for you know, for one of my boats. Also consider that if you're just running the motor on earmuffs down here and the skeg is not in water, then the motor is operating with reduced back pressure. That can make it idle a little bit high, make it run just a little bit lean. So if it runs a little bit funny, or it takes a minute to start up, especially if it's being cold, be patient with it, give it a minute to warm up, then you can shut it off and try and fire it up again, and it should just pop right off. So I'm going to show you how to start up one of these ones, and then we're going to look for more things to look for. So now we're going to fire her up. To do that, we have to connect a couple things to the motor. First off, the battery cables, nothing too hard about that. You got your gas. For all of my motors, I use premix oil and gas for my two-stroke motors. Even though this one, the oil injection system is still working, I just I send premix through just because it's easier for me. Nothing wrong with that. You want to hook the hose with earmuffs down to the water intake on the skeg. Here's the little holes for your water intake. Make sure that they're well covered up. And there you go. A note about that. I have run into people who believe that it's fine to run your outboard motor without a hose attached for up to 5 minutes because it takes that long to overheat the motor. Technically, yes, they're correct. However, the impeller down there, which is this little rubber thing that spins around and pumps water all throughout the motor, needs lubrication in order to function. Just a couple seconds of running it dry and it will destroy itself. So if you're trying to destroy your impeller, that's a great way to do it. If not, put your earmuffs on. Lastly, you need your wiring harness. I made a bunch of these pigtail wiring harness just for working on multiple motors, but oftentimes it's a great long affair, 16 or 18 feet long, with a control box and cables and whatnot. Alright, so we're going to turn on the water and we're going to give her a go. Process of starting your motor. Take your bulb, pump it until it's nice and tight, doesn't really compress anymore, turn the water on and crank it over. You're going to want to look for a couple things. First, see how easily it starts. Like I said before, if it takes a try or two, especially if it's cold or it's been sitting for a minute, don't necessarily knock it off. That's fine. That's par for the course, even for newer motors. You're going to want to make sure that it revs up and that it's able to idle. A warmed up motor should definitely be able to idle on the stand, even if there's no back pressure. So if it idles a little bit high, that's not a big deal, but just make sure that it idles. Once it's warmed up, I'll give it a few revs, rev it up, allow it to return to idle, make sure that's all pretty reliable. So let's give her a go. Alright, a couple things to take note. We got some water here at one of the water jacket gaskets that's just starting to seep out when this thing runs. Not a big deal, can run for many years, even leaking all over the place. It's just going to drain down here. However, you're probably going to want to get a new gasket. That corrosion, which I mentioned before, is going to be a challenge, but these bolts look like they're pretty big. So hopefully they'll come out, new gasket in. Gasket's what, $10 or whatever, and it's not going to be a very difficult repair. However, it is something to note. Now about pumping water. Obviously you want your outboard motor to pump water, but whether it does or it doesn't, you're replacing the impeller anyway. I'm going to be doing several videos about how to replace impellers on different motors. Even if this impeller is brand new, you're going to be replacing your impeller anyway. You should be doing it at least every other year. I do mine once a year as part of preventive maintenance, but if this is a new motor for you, you're going to be replacing your impeller anyway. An important part about whether or not this thing is pumping, though, you want to see it pumping, not because you know whether or not the impeller is any good, but so all these passageways which distribute water throughout the motor are clear and haven't pulled up any sediment or gunk or any barnacles or anything and are blocking them off, because that's more of a repair. Inside here there's like a serpentine system where it goes all the way up and all the way down on this side too to totally cool your motor, and you want to make sure that those are all clear. About cooling your motor, after you've let this thing run for 5-10 minutes or so, you should be able to touch the motor like this. If it's too hot to touch for more than a couple seconds, that's fine. But if you just touch and ow, it's way too hot, this thing is overheating and you have some kind of a clog in here. This thing can still pump and piss out water all day long with a clog in here. Most of the exhausted coolant comes out with the exhaust, with the propeller. If you have this thing in the water, it will often come out here. Some motors, they do spit out here when they're on the stand. Some motors don't. Just because it's not doesn't mean there's anything wrong. That's just how the motor is set up. Now we're going to check the trim pump. It's actually not too hard. Just make it go up and down. Sometimes the motor has to be on. Turn the motor on. Up. And down. Not much to that one. Just make sure you go all the way up and all the way down. And when it's up, look at the motor in here and look at the hydraulic system. Just make sure that you're not leaking. It should be relatively quiet and it should go up relatively smoothly. Some motors don't have switches on the side. That's fine. Find the wires that come out and you can just jump them to a battery. Now we're going to talk about the number one most important thing to check when you're buying a used motor, and that is the compression of the motor. If you do not come and do a compression test on a motor before you buy it, I got no sympathy for your problems later. Let's talk about compression. Checking the compression, I'm going to put a video up on the specific process of how to do it. However, it is so important because it is the number one indicator of the health of your motor. These motors, they start out at a certain compression. That number is often not made public because it varies even from motor to motor, even same year, same model. So you can't say, oh, stock it was 140 psi, now it's such and such psi. That means it has so many hours on it. That would be real nice to know, but we don't know that. So there's a couple things to look for in noting whether or not you have good compression. First, is your compression above a certain value? And second, are they relatively close to each other? What I mean is this. My boat over there, I have a Johnson 200 on it. Compression is all around 85 psi. Most people would think that's very low. However, the thing puts out a ton of power and it runs extremely reliably. That's because all the cylinders are relatively close to each other. If you have a number in mind, oh, I want a motor that's above 100 psi, fine. I don't care. Just as long as you're not down like at 60 psi. If all the cylinders are at 60 psi, it's going to run like shit. The lower the compression and the wider the gaps between the two, the worse the motor is going to run, the less power it's going to have. Whenever I check out a motor and put it up for sale, I always check the compression and then I write the numbers on each cylinder. You see 130, 125, 125, 130. Very good compression on this old Force motor. They're all within, they're all pretty high, and they're all within, just 5 psi of each other. Typically people say that 10% is going to be good for a motor. Anything beyond that, you're going to start getting a little bit of a lopey idle, you're going to get less power, etc., etc. Older V6 models didn't start out with very much compression. You can see this one is 105, 110, 110, 105, 110. This one runs great, puts out a lot of power, and it runs very reliably, starts right up. So just because it's a little bit low like this doesn't mean it's a shitty motor. It probably just didn't start out with as much as that Mercury Force over there. Not a bad idea to make sure the motor is still charging. The motor can run perfectly fine and not charge the battery. You're going to want a motor which charges the battery while it's running. Just do a simple DC volt test on the battery. 13 and a half, somewhere around there while it's idling. Maybe a little more while revving is fine. This is the lower unit. The lower unit has a couple of important components. First is the impeller and the impeller pump that we already talked about. That sits right about here. It's got the pump. It takes water from here, shoots it up into the motor. The second are the forward and reverse gears. The drive shaft comes right down the center of it right here, and your controls, and a shift shaft, which right here comes down like here, is controlled by the controls, which shifts this thing into forward, neutral, and reverse. While you're running the motor, it's a good idea to shift through the gears. Make sure that it operates smoothly. It's fairly easy to clunk it in and out of gears. Don't over rev it while you're trying to shift it. Don't rev it up and then try and shift it. Shift it at idle as you're supposed to. And make sure that it goes into the gears and the propeller spins the right way. The gears are bathed in lower unit oil. Lower unit oil, this is the, here's the vent, here's the top plug, and all the way down here is the bottom plug. Just comes out with a simple screwdriver. It's pretty important to check the lower unit oil. To do that, you just get a big fat screwdriver, open this up, let a little bit of it dribble out. If it's black, that means that it's in need of replacement, but that your seals are probably still good. If it's blue or green, those are common colors for lower unit oil. That means that it's fairly fresh oil. If it's milky, brown in color, milky or chunky, that means that most likely one of your seals has gone bad. There's a seal which is right in here, which keeps seawater out. And then there's a seal that sits oftentimes below the impeller housing. That one also keeps seawater out as well. So one or the other of those have gone bad. Now just because a seal has gone bad doesn't mean that the whole lower unit is trash. If you don't have any metal, see there's a little magnet on the other side of these plugs typically. If you don't have any metal shavings there, and if it still operates fine, then generally all you need is a new seal, new oil, you're still in business. Doesn't mean that the lower unit is bad. However, you do have to replace those seals. Now this one up here isn't that hard to do, and you can often do it when you replace your impeller. However, the one down here requires a special tool to pull all this shit out, and a lot of times people don't have that special tool or whatever. So that one can be a little bit of a hassle to get to. Not that hard though. It's still doable for your backyard mechanic. This is a fuel-injected 4-stroke motor. Very, very good motor. This motor represents manufacturers' attempts to make these motors more efficient, more reliable, more precise. So this one runs like a dream. And when you're checking one of these out, a 4-stroke, these ones do have engine oil. You can just pull out the dipstick, take a look what you got in there, make sure it's not milky. Very similar to checking out a car. You know, you want to look at certain things, you know, like head gaskets, you know, make sure there's no water in the oil. It shouldn't really be burning any oil out of the exhaust. The exhaust should be fairly clear, unlike in a 2-stroke, which belches out a lot of white smoke. That's normal because you're always burning oil whenever you're burning gasoline. On this one, like a car, a lawnmower, or any other 4-stroke machine, it shouldn't really be burning any oil. So things that you already know about checking out 4-stroke motors from working on cars and trucks and stuff will pretty much apply here. Well guys, I'm just about out of ideas on things to check. I hope that you found this video useful. I'm sure I forgot a couple of things. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. I'll make a little annotation or whatever. But yeah, if you have any questions about this, let me know.